In this lecture, we'll discuss tissue repair and inflammation. So sometimes we have boo-boos, okay? We have damaged tissue, we're going to need to fix that, okay? We call this wound healing or tissue repair. We're going to need to get rid of all the dead and damaged stuff, and we're going to need to replace that with new cells and new tissues. Okay? We have two different ways that we can do this. We can either do regeneration or we can do fibrosis. Some tissues can do regeneration. Okay, if we do regeneration, the dead and the damaged cells are replaced with the same type of cells. Okay? But not everything can do that. Some tissues, instead of doing regeneration, instead they do fibrosis. Okay, so basically the damaged and the dead cells are removed instead of replacing with the same type of cells and tissues. Fibroblasts are instead going to fill that wound location with scar tissue, which is mostly dense irregular connective tissue instead. Now, this presents a problem sometimes depending on the location. So if we're talking about our epithelial layer, usually we can just do regeneration. Okay, so maybe you have a paper cut, you cut out all this dead stuff and you replace it with new epithelial cells. It's no big deal. Okay. However, if we're talking about your cardiac muscle cells, your heart, okay, cardiac muscle cells are not capable of doing regeneration. We're not going to just make new heart muscle. So instead, we're going to take out all this dead stuff, and instead we're going to fill it with a bunch of collagen, fibroblasts, things like that. But guess what we've lost? Okay, so collagen fibers, fibroblasts, this connective tissue, it's not capable of muscle contraction, which is what your heart was good for. So you are not only replacing this with a different type of tissue, but you're also losing functionality here. Okay, if you do that enough, your heart efficiency is dramatically decreased. Okay, the same could be said for epithelial tissue as well. If you damage your epithelium enough to where you are not replacing with new epithelial cells, but if you are replacing with scar tissue instead, then you are possibly losing functionality on your skin as well. So think about really bad burns, third-degree burns. You're not replacing that with new epithelial tissue, it's scar tissue. Well, your skin has functions. Okay, it does things. One of them is body temperature regulation through sweating. So if you destroy all of that, you're not going to just make new sweat glands, things like that. So you've lost some functionality there as well. So regeneration is ideal. Okay, we're replacing the old with the new, but it's the same stuff. But just fibrosis, it is an option. It is something that some tissues have to work with. But you are going to potentially lose functionality there. Now, if we have damage, okay, there are a couple of steps that we're going to see happen over and over each time we have wound healing that needs to recur. So the first thing, we're going to have inflammation. Okay, so you have damaged yourself, so maybe this is just a giant paper cut. Okay, the first thing is going to be hemostasis. We're going to need to make a blood clot so we can stop just bleeding all over the place. Okay, once hemostasis or blood clotting has started, we are going to do a little bit of vasodilation. Okay, so vasodilation means we're going to open up those blood vessels a little bit more. Why are we doing that? Well, we need to recruit some of our cells and substances that are going to be involved in healing this wound, and so they have to get here. Okay, histamine is one of the things that promotes vasodilation. Okay, and it's just going to allow us to start the cleanup process. The cells that are involved in the cleanup need to get to the site of cleanup. Okay. Now, inflammation comes with a few typical symptoms. And the site gets red and hot and swollen and painful. Okay, so these are just your typical symptoms of inflammation. Once we start cleanup, this is our picture of vasodilation. So you can see some of our cells. These are white cells. white blood cells. Okay. They have exited the blood vessel and they've entered the tissues instead. They're going to go start cleaning up that wound site and get rid of dead cells and damaged tissues and things like that. And here's our redness and our swelling and things like that from inflammation. So next is migration. Okay, so we said that we're going to have to do some tissue cleanup. Okay, I just mentioned that's the job of some of your white blood cells. Also fibroblasts that are going to start creating the new tissues. So they are going to migrate towards the site of cleanup and where we're going to need to start building new tissues. Right? We're not going to build from the outside in. We're going to start in and we're going to work our way out. Okay, so that's why we're migrating downwards. Okay, you at this point have made a nice scab. Okay, so you're no longer bleeding, which is good. Okay, and then our fibroblasts go to work. We do proliferation. Okay, we are proliferating our new cells. We're making new cells and new tissues. So our fibroblasts, they're cranking out new collagen fibers. Anything that we can regenerate, maybe we need to grow some new blood cells, something like that. That happens here. So you can see that our wound has gotten more shallow as we are starting to create new tissues. And then last but not least, everything has to just mature. Okay, if the wound is really deep, you are going to get a scar that forms. Okay, because you've cranked out a bunch of collagen. Okay. We mentioned a little bit ago that if the wound is bad enough and you have damaged multiple layers of your skin, specifically your accessory organs could have been damaged. So the glands, sweat glands, oil glands, hairs, nerve endings, those things aren't necessarily going to come back. Okay, so if it's just over a really small portion of your skin, that you've got this one little scar, that's probably not life-altering. But if this occurs over 30 or 40% of your body, then you could have some major loss of function there. And eventually your scab falls off. Okay, eventually your scab falls off once we have completed this process. And so here's just another example. We've got our wound. We're going to need to stop the blood flow. We start recruitment, migratory phase. We've got all these cells that are coming to clean up all this damaged tissue. We start cranking out new tissue, replacing the old stuff with the new stuff, and we are left with the finished product. Now, we mentioned that we do have two different ways in which we can repair tissue, either the regeneration or the fibrosis. A lot of that has to do with a couple of factors. One is the ability to undergo mitosis. So epithelial tissue is really good at mitosis still, so it's really good at regeneration. Okay. Most of your connective tissues are also really good at regeneration, but there are exceptions. So your connective tissue propers, your dense, regular, and irregular, your areolar, your adipose, even your bone in your blood, okay, those regenerate easily. There's still a lot of ability to do mitosis. Cartilage, however, is an exception. Okay, so cartilage heals by fibrosis instead. Okay, a lot of that has to do with the short supply of blood. Remember, cartilage is avascular. Okay, so it doesn't have that direct blood supply. It's harder to get all of the repair mechanisms to the site of the wound, and also cartilage chondrocytes or chondrocytes just don't really do mitosis. Okay, so once you damage it, you're not really going to grow new cartilage. You're going to do fibrosis instead. Muscle tissue, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Smooth muscle usually does regeneration. Okay, but cardiac and skeletal muscle usually do fibrosis instead. So if you damage your heart tissue, you're not growing new heart tissue. You're growing scar tissue instead. And then lastly, your nervous tissue also does fibrosis. So if you damage your nerves, your spinal cord, your brain, you're not growing new brain. Okay, you're going to grow scar tissue instead. Other things that affect your ability to do tissue repair, we've mentioned blood supply over and over and over. The better blood supply that you have increases your opportunity to transport all of the supplies that you need to do tissue repair. Also your nutrition, and that's something that we don't necessarily think about off the top of our head, but you need a lot of protein to do tissue repair, because all of the collagen fibers, that's all protein. So you're going to need a lot of amino acids to create all these new collagen proteins. If your diet is lacking in protein and you suddenly need to do a good bit of tissue repair, you might not have enough amino acids on hand to create enough collagen fibers, okay, to do proper tissue repair. Vitamin C is also a requirement for fibroblasts to create fully functional protein. And so if you don't have an adequate supply of vitamin C in your diet, and again, if you have a wound that you need to repair, your collagen fibers might not be quite as functional as they could be. And then again, we've mentioned over and over adequate blood supply to deliver the oxygen, the nutrients, even the immune system cells that we talked about that help clean up the damaged tissue. If you don't have a good blood supply, it makes it a little bit harder to do proper tissue repair.